I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1717 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, and in this episode, also by none other than Dr. Bob Rodrigues, a history professor of note up there at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right there on the banks of the mighty Monongahela River. In the next 3 episodes, he's going to be talking about a year in Vietnam that was steeped in infamy. That was 1968. In this episode, he's going to enumerate the reasons why it was a year of infamy, with emphasis on the situation at Khe Sanh and then leading into the Tet Offensive. Again, I'd like to encourage you to sit back, relax, get a pen and paper nearby so you can make notes, and get rid of all your distractions. Turn off the TV, turn off the game console, shut off your cell phone. Run all the noisy people out of the room so you can concentrate on what Dr. Bob is going to tell you about 1968 in Vietnam. It is such a privilege to get this information from a distinguished history professor up there at Duquesne University. So with that in mind, I'm handing the microphone over to Dr. Bob. It's all yours. Take it over.
Hi, Mac. Great to be back. And today we are going to talk about the Tet Offensive primarily, actually the entire year of 1968, but the Tet Offensive as a turning point in the Vietnam War. Let's look at 1968 and overall. 1968 ranks up there with some of the most memorable dates in American history. And I would say 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, 1861, of course, with the Civil War, 1941 with Pearl Harbor, and then, of course, we had 9/11, 2001. We could argue that 2020 will be a memorable date as well because of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. But 1968 also has a place there. Now, let me take a little walk through 68 so you can see the events that were occurring. On January 23rd, North Korea captures the USS Pueblo, a Navy ship in North Korean waters, and paraded the sailors right before TV for the world to show that they had captured us. Colonel Buechner was the commander of that ship. They name, rank, and serial number, but then North Korea began to use some torture tactics. In fact, one of the sailors perished due to his wounds, and eventually it was determined that the ship was a spy ship. Okay. However, what this did, this was embarrassing to the United States. This was an embarrassment because eventually they were released, and it was revealed that Colonel Buechner had, to save the lives of his sailors, had admitted to some things. Again, this just started the year off on a bad note that the United States was embarrassed by North Korea. On January 31st, we had the Tet Offensive. It actually began on the 30th. We'll talk about that. And then on the 31st is the big date. I'll come back to that. In February 11th to the 17th, we had the bloodiest week of the entire Vietnam War. 543 Americans are killed, 2,547 are wounded. That's the bloodiest week of Vietnam. On March the 31st of that year, LBJ announces, quote, "I will not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party as your president." On April 4th, Martin Luther King is assassinated. On June the 5th, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. On August 23rd to 26th, we had the Chicago Convention. There were protests, there were riots. Hubert Humphrey was nominated for the Democratic presidential ticket. And this has always been seen as almost like America in a civil war. And any film that you see of it is pretty daunting, pretty nasty. October 16th, there were Olympic protests. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, two African Americans who won a race. They stood to receive their medals, and they raised their fists in protest. So what this shows is there's still that breach in civil rights and the African Americans and all what was going on. Of course, this was a response to Martin Luther King's assassination as well. On November 5th, Richard Nixon is elected President of the United States. And on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 orbits the moon. This is the first of American spaceships to go to the moon. They did not land, but they went to the moon and they went around it 10 times. It was quite a different ending to the year because most of what I have recounted for you have been very events. And this event was uplifting because this was the first time a picture of Earth was taken from space. So we just saw this fragile planet, okay, in green and blue, and it really sent quite a message. And Lovell, Anders, and Borman, the three astronauts, read from the book of Genesis, the first 10 verses, because, and Lovell explained it. He says, most religions on Earth, the first 10 verses of Genesis, there's a common there, not just Christianity. Well, the Tet Offensive. Scholarship on the Tet Offensive, even 1968 as a whole, now begins to focus their attention on the pivotal events that took place during that fateful year. Regarding Vietnam, in late November of 1967, we talked about this last time, General William Westmoreland and President Lyndon Johnson publicly conveyed their optimism regarding eventual United States victory in Vietnam. And this helped President Johnson to buoy, the flagging support of the American public. In retrospect, the success offensive of November of 1967 convinced many Americans that their fears and doubts had been wrong. So for the moment, public confidence stemmed from the erosion of support of the war. But the price is going to be very high. The government purchased public support in the present with a promise for the future. And then when this promise was not held, the backlash was even greater. Robert McNamara, we know, resigns, and Clark Clifford takes over. This is in November of 68. And North Vietnam was planning a strategy, a war strategy for 1968. What they were trying to do was to, first of all, to get the United States to focus more in the South because they had been bombing Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. And also maybe to get them to leave. Okay, so they wanted to launch a two-pronged, bold offensive for early of 1968. Now, the first part of that was an attack on the United States fire base at Khe Sanh. And second was a coordinated attack on South Vietnam's provincial capitals by the NVA and the VC. Okay, this was going to be all over South Vietnam. It was going to be coordinated, simultaneous on the night of or early morning of January the 31st. The first phase of that assault actually began on January 30th. There had been some miscommunication with some of the commanders of the Viet Cong, and therefore they struck on the first half hour of the Year of the Monkey, because the Year of the Monkey began on January 30th. 12:30 in the morning, they had launched their attacks on 7 cities. Now, this should have been maybe a warning to us that something's going to go on. Now, there's going to be an array of errors on the part of United States decision makers that is going to lead to a real surprise with regard to the Tet Offensive. They planned this, of course, during the Tet lunar holiday, which is the Vietnamese New Year. Now, this was done purposely, and think about this. This was a holiday somewhat like maybe our Thanksgiving, and therefore a lot of people were moving around, moving about, going to see their family members to enjoy in the festival. So this took attention away from a lot of the civilians who were really VC, who were moving supplies into certain areas. So, the traffic was higher, but it was like, okay, it's the Tet. Okay, it's the Tet holiday. The second thing was the Tet holiday was celebrated with fireworks. So when these surprise attacks were launched, people heard the cracking of guns. They thought possibly it was just the fireworks. So it caught them off guard. And when this became more intense and more consistent, constant, then that alerted them to this, this possibility. But let's slide back to Khe Sanh for a moment. See, Khe Sanh was a base in the northwest corner of South Vietnam, okay? They were 10 miles from the DMZ and 4 miles from Laos. It was a strategic location because they weren't far from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they could hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail from there. They could also observe the traffic that was occurring in that area and therefore gauge how much equipment, people, material were going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Vo Nguyen Giap organized a major offensive against Khe Sanh. The United States rushed more Marines into Khe Sanh. It got up to 6,000 at the Khe Sanh base. The NVA, their numbers were estimated at 20,000, but perhaps even double that. No official numbers. And, we could probably take 30,000 as the median. The Marines were clearly outnumbered at Khe Sanh. And since the NVA were moving so many troops there, it almost looked like this was the battle, of the Vietnam War. Even Westmoreland, what he did is he asked for reports on Dien Bien Phu and how, see if there's any likenesses here. What were they doing in preparation for Dien Bien Phu that could be being done with Khe Sanh? Khe Sanh did have mountains around it, not completely around it, but to its north and west, there were, highlands and mountains. So even Johnson was so preoccupied by Khe Sanh that he had a diorama built in the White House so that he could, and they had all these little images of troops, and he would move them about when he was told that things were happening at Khe Sanh. He would get up in the middle of the night and check any communications to see what was going on at Khe Sanh. Again, our focus, both by Westmoreland and by our political leaders, Lyndon Johnson, was that Khe Sanh was going to be the Armageddon. This was where the buck was going to stop. This is what the Vietnamese were trying to do. They were trying to create just a tremendous victory, a stellar victory, similar to what they had done at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 against the French. So what this does is this allows the North Vietnamese to continue to move people and material into the South. Because even though this was heated up and Westmoreland knew there was indeed more traffic going into the South, he still was focused on Khe Sanh. As far as expecting a surprise surprise attack on provincial capitals all over South Vietnam. This was not in his thinking. His thinking was focused on Quezon.
I'm going to pause Dr. Bob's presentation right now so that you can mentally download all the information he has given you about the year of 1968 in Vietnam. Don't miss the next episode because he's going to tell you all about the Tet Offensive in a very understandable manner that will help you see it probably better than you've ever seen it. So don't miss it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1717 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?